Well, I'm excited because I actually hit my record button this time.
This is Auto Collabs.
That's impressive.
It's the
there's
little
a lot of
wins.
moving parts when it comes to like getting on a Zoom call and, you know, pressing record. Lots of moving parts.
Got recording video, recording audio. You know, go ahead,
How do I
Michael.
use this? I gotta push a button.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because like Cirillo, again, he has a device that he gets to use to remind himself, which is a comb right now.
Yeah, right. He has to reach the press. You know, one of the first podcasts that I did years ago, it was in person with this, like a local Syracuse businessman. He's a young guy, and he was also like super fit, like a fitness influencer, like really before fitness influencers were everywhere, and he had a big following. And so he has a local restaurant here, and I just saw him. I was like, hey, could you be on my podcast at some point? He's like, sure. I show up, set up in the restaurant. We talk for like, and that was back when we were like, yo, we're going to make it count. We're doing 30, 40 minutes, right? Back when podcasting was the thing.
Crushed the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I crushed the whole thing, and about 5 minutes before it was over, you know what I realized?
100%.
Didn't hit the record button, and I will never forget his face when I was like, hey, so had a couple technical difficulties with my finger in that record button. So the second time we recorded, he was really gracious. And the second time we recorded, though, it was like, 18 minutes and probably a lot better than the 40-minute version.
There you go. That's perfect.
But he never talked to me again. I'm just kidding.
Well,
that's
we
not
are
gonna happen, though,
handling.
today.
We're talking to a new friend of ours, Charlie Chesbrough, today, which we think maybe from Paul's original 40 to 18-minute experience podcasting, we've got a little bit more leverage on our expertise and skill. However, when it comes to Economist, man, I know that I've got a lot to learn. You know, Cox, we've gotten to know Jonathan Smoke, and every time he speaks, I'm like tuned in, pen to paper, because there's just what I'm realizing is that we can extrapolate so much from the data that some of these companies have into what we're doing on the boots on ground level. So I'm excited to kind of see like where are we at from their perspective, from his perspective, and kind of current market data and where the market might be headed, because there is. Right now, it's almost like you can't look at the data too tight, but you have to look at it because it can tell a story. For sure.
So with all of that anticipation built, boys, let's get our record button fingers ready and jump into this conversation with Charlie Chesbrough.
Charlie Chesbrough, it is so good to have you on the Auto Collabs podcast. I think this is the very first time we've had anyone with Economist in their title on the podcast. Senior Economist and Senior Director of Industry Insights at Cox Automotive. Thanks for being on, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Honored to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So, okay, first question, and this is a big one. Is it Charlie or Charles? Because I've seen them different places all over the internet. Where am I headed here?
Yeah, we're going with Charlie these days. A little bit less formal. Maybe doesn't sound as
no
intelligent,
tie,
but we're
right?
going with it.
He's like kind of like the COVID beard, the no tie. It's Charlie, right?
That's right.
Charles wore a tie. Charlie is chilling out a little bit.
Post-COVID Charlie.
I love it. I love it. Well, appreciate you coming on today. You know, it's interesting because we've had Steve Greenfield on the show before, and a lot of times when I think when we kind of hear and you know, a lot of people have seen you around events and on interviews both inside and outside of automotive just because of the presence of Cox and the data that it has. But a lot of times economists kind of get put in this bucket where it's like these guys have the data, they say the data, and then they get out. And what I want to start with is, you know, obviously everyone kind of has the how they got an automotive story, and it looks like you have a history outside of automotive, looking at data and looking at markets. And I'd love to hear kind of how that transition worked, how looking at data and markets outside of automotive has moved you into auto and given you a perspective that's maybe altogether different.
Yeah, boy, well, I got to go way back if you're going to cover my whole career, because it really started in the late 1980s. My first job out of college was working as a floor trader at the Chicago Board of Trade. So I was one of those guys with a phone on my head and
yelling
arbitrage orders, and it was crazy.
It's really that crazy. Just
It was really that crazy. And
who are you yelling at? I think a lot of people don't know that. Like, who are you yelling to?
well, I had traders on the phone in New York that were asking me to put out orders. So they'd be like, sell 50 at 50. And I'd be like, hey, 50, 50, 50, like that. And arbing an order out to our trader out in the pit, and they'd scream to get the order. And then I'd yell it back on the phone, and hey, it was filled. And yeah, it was a pretty crazy environment, but that's
so
where I
crazy.
first started.
It actually seems a little Neanderthalic to me at this point.
Well, and it doesn't exist anymore. It's been replaced by computers. So, but it was.
I had to ask. I never knew the answer to that question.
No, it was a really unique environment, I have to say. A lot like Trading Places, if you remember that old movie,
right?
Eddie Murphy movie.
Right.
But no, I started there, and I really started looking at data there to really kind of understand financial data and all of that. But it was really a few years after that when I started working for a telecom company, and everybody had a phone number, and it was with that unique phone number that I was able to bring together. Like, hey, we could link in their customer satisfaction data, and we could link in, hey, what phone did they purchase data, and all this other information because we had that unique phone number. And from that, I was able to get into the automotive industry where we had the VIN, the vehicle identification number. And again, this is early 2000s, late 1990s. It was kind of new to be building big databases like this. And so I started working at Ford in their marketing strategy group, and from there have worked for a number of companies in automotive, but I've been with Cox for a little over 5 years now. And it's a really interesting company in automotive because we have so much information as to what's happening. Really, once the vehicle is built, Cox Automotive has a finger involved in all aspects of the vehicle market, of getting that vehicle, from the factory to the dealer to the consumer, all of that. We've got our hands in everything.
Okay, this whole telecom to auto relationship is really, it's coming out in a lot of different places for me right now, because even when you look at like consumer side in thinking about trade cycle management and all of the things that telecom, it seems like always kind of has an edge up on automotive, and like a 3 to 5 year edge on the things that they're thinking about and looking at. And to think, okay, the center of the data in telecom is the customer cell phone, but the center of the data in automotive is the vehicle record, more primarily. And now it's interesting because maybe we're 20 years behind, but it seems like we're actually moving back to an idea where the center of the data in automotive is the telephone again, and then like the connected data is potentially the VIN. Have you seen other trends along the way where like you probably still kind of like keep the pulse of telecom, I'm guessing, because you have that history, but have you seen other trends where like auto, maybe we're seeing something that telecom was doing 3 or 4 years ago that now we're starting to learn in automotive that we need to be looking at? I don't know. I'm just thinking there's more parallels there that you're probably seeing because of your perspective.
I think you're onto something there. I mean, one that we're seeing in automotive is a lot of the futuristic talk is that it's going to be customer data captured within the vehicle that is going to be monetized, and the auto companies are going to figure out a way to make money on your medical information or biorhythms, whatever they can kind of capture as you're sitting in that vehicle seat, on top of information they might gather as you drive around. And it's sort of a data vacuum connecting to various Wi-Fi networks of where you're going. And, there's grandiose ideas of what they can do with all this data. And that's all tied to telecom as well, in terms of the customer being the focus of the data. But the other thing that's going to be kind of interesting with automotive is that we've seen over the last few years what I kind of describe as the iPhone-ification of the vehicle product planning. It used to be you built a vehicle, you sold that vehicle essentially unchanged for 3 or 4 years, maybe longer if you could. And then that was sort of the way to be the most profitable. But nowadays, we're finding that you have to upgrade that vehicle much more frequently with more technology, more bells and whistles on that vehicle. People aren't willing to just let a vehicle be unchanged for long periods of time. And it's much like with the iPhone. You got to add more stuff every version, or else why buy the next version when my old version's just fine? And I think we're seeing more of that within automotive, and that's a real challenge for the industry because there's a long lead time in product planning with automotive, and having to turn around things quickly and be more flexible in manufacturing has been a challenge for the industry. But thus far, they seem to have been doing it fairly well.
All right, before Paul asks his question, because he's got a question, I'm bringing a shirt to SoduCon for you. It's going to be called the iPhone-ification of automotive. Right there. It's perfect. I love it.
That's the hard-hitting documentary, the iPhone-ification of the automotive industry, featuring Charlie Chesbrough. Okay, so Mike, now the T-shirt and that show just totally got me off my game right now. When it comes to using economic, you said the planning cycles for automotive are usually further out. Do you see those condensing? Like because of, okay, we'll ask what you're seeing and then what you actually predict. In the sense that planning cycles with EV platforms might be a little bit maybe easier just because like the drivetrain is so standardized across models. Do you see that planning cycle compressing, or do you still think it has to be the same because of the way the manufacturing process is in general? So I'm just curious, now that you mentioned that, what you think it's going to be, and is it getting faster?
I think the future is that EV platforms should be able to be redesigned much more quickly, with the idea, sort of the skateboard idea, right, where you've got the bottom guts, the powertrain of the vehicle, and you just kind of slap a different top on top of it to make a whole bunch of different versions of the vehicle. That's sort of the idea of where EV manufacturing is essentially going to be going, but we're not there yet. So I don't know that there's a big savings on time just yet in terms of product planning that's been experienced by the manufacturers. But it's still they're working today. The engineers are working today on the vehicles that are going to be coming out in 26, 27, 28. There's a very long lead time, and you've got to set up your supply base and, who's going to make what part. And when it comes to the electric vehicles, one of the big challenges the industry is dealing with right now is sourcing future batteries. Right. Everybody wants to be making and selling 1 million EVs, every manufacturer a couple of years from now. But right now, those batteries don't exist to even put into those vehicles. So, there's a lot of planning going forward that the EV market's going to get much bigger and sell many more vehicles. But in terms of the supplies being there to make all of that happen, we don't have that yet in the industry, and that has to be built as well.
So it's obvious that you're very well versed, right, and from top to bottom in the automotive ecosystem. But we're here to talk economics for a minute. And I know it all comes together. Can you give us a baseline, because we try to teach to the back of the class, especially with some of these, and Auto Collab's podcast is about really drawing a big circle around as many people in the industry as we can and having them take a step closer. So can you give us like the 101 on what economic indicators we should be relying on the economists for, and what that should be doing to our decision making?
Well, boy, that's a big question.
Little question, right? Just get it all into one little question. Yeah. Get it into one 60-second packet for us, and just
there's a lot of metrics that economists look at that are going to tell us, will the economy slip into recession, and will unemployment start to rise, those types of things. And certainly I would say all Americans should be aware of those types of things, like the yield curve inverting, where you get a higher interest rate on a shorter term loan than you do a longer term loan. We've had that happen in the economy recently, and that's generally an indicator that we're going to slip into recession at some point in the near future. Those are kind of big numbers, but the more practical numbers, I think, that really affect consumers and their daily lives are certainly interest rates and what the Federal Reserve policy is and what it will be. That's had a dramatic change over just the last couple months, and it's going to continue to be quite volatile over the next 2 years. And of course, just energy costs and food costs. We've seen gasoline costs spike dramatically, and they're coming down almost just as dramatically. That's a sector in the economy, energy in particular, with this Ukraine war going on, that's going to remain very volatile. We saw natural gas prices hit a record level just today or yesterday. Yeah. This is all going to have an impact on the future of the economy and people's ability to buy vehicles, both new and used. And it's going to have an impact on their overall consumer confidence. We've seen consumer confidence has fallen dramatically over the last few months as people get really concerned about inflation. And one thing we know about the U.S. economy is nothing makes people feel worse than seeing high prices at the gas pump. That just kills the American consumer. They hate it. It's right in their face every day of the cost of filling up that gas tank. And it really peaked just a couple of weeks ago. And like I said, it's getting better. But that's a metric that people need to watch and certainly dealers need to pay attention to, because that's going to kind of gauge the mood of the consumers as they're shopping here in the fall.
Well, I think that's really interesting that like you didn't start with, inventory dynamics or the ability of automakers to, you started with how are consumers perceiving the market, what's their ability to purchase, and then we back into all of the other layers of data, right? Because if the end user of the thing that we're selling has a certain perception or ability or capacity to engage with us based on their, the way that they're perceiving the market or their own jobs or their own personal economy, then that backs into like, what inventory do we need? What type of the sales process or marketing process, or all of that is predicated on really the consumer experience, which is like, I'm just going to be honest. I wouldn't typically expect, anyone that's looking at data to lead with data from a customer perspective is the first thing. And so one, I just want to say I appreciate that. But two, just like for the dealers and for the industry partners listening to this, like if a data centric person that is an economist and speaks to economy on a broad scale and understands the inventory, and they're looking at the consumer first, then we all should be doing that. Period.
I feel so validated. Because every morning Kyle and I have a morning show, right, where we're always like, pay attention to how your consumer's feeling coming in because of this, that, and the other. And now we just have, a senior economist come in and say, let's think about how the customer is thinking about this when they walk into your store. I love it so much.
And so I want to, we're all over the place. We're excited. We're excited. But you keyed in on this thing where it's like the perception of the economy is driven by the fact that the prices that you see as you drive around on a daily basis are driven by two types of billboards. One, paid billboards, and two, gas price billboards, because that's the only time that we see prices out and about when we're not actually in shopping mode. And I had never considered that till you said that. I mean, I knew that everybody kind of looks at gases, but or that looks at gas prices, but that it's a daily kind of reminder, no matter where you go, whether you're shopping
every
or not.
day. Yeah, every day really it's in people's faces. And one of the interesting things that we've seen out there, in really post-COVID, is that because we've had this shock to the U.S. economy, the composition of who is buying vehicles has changed dramatically. And that we can actually see in our data that prior and post sort of March of 2020, the average interest rate that people are paying when they sign a contract, when they purchase a new vehicle, has fallen dramatically. It was sort of about 6% was the average interest rate. It fell to about a 4.5% interest rate. Not because interest rates went down, but because all of the folks that were paying 10% and higher interest rates, that were lifting the average, fell out of the market. So that what remains are only higher credit, better credit quality folks.
Wow.
That's who can afford to buy a new vehicle these days. And the other thing that's really interesting with that is that the average interest rate that the different brands cater to, who their customers are, varies greatly. Subaru and Honda customers and Volvo customers, on average, they're getting like a 2 or 3% interest rate on average is what those customers are paying when they buy a vehicle. When you get into a Mitsubishi or a Dodge, their interest rates can be 10% plus on some of them. That, massive difference in the type of person, because the interest rate kind of reflects the credit quality of the person who would be coming in as to what they would qualify for an interest rate. And so who's vulnerable in that environment when interest rates go up dramatically? You would just think that folks that brands that cater to a higher interest rate customer are going to be more vulnerable than those brands catering to a lower interest rate customer, because the higher interest rate customers are really going to see their interest rates rise here as interest rates go up in this environment. And the other, as a result of all of this, of the lower credit score folks dropping out of the new vehicle market, whoever remains in the new vehicle market buying vehicles today is getting a very similar interest rate. So we've consolidated consumers. So before we had consumers getting anywhere from 0 to 15% interest rates, it's all consolidated down, that we have a much smaller group of variation around that, so that all of the brands are pretty much catering to the same kind of financial customer today. You don't have a big variation. So it's getting that much more competitive out there in terms of competition among who's in the vehicle market buying today. Well, financially, they're a very similar customer across the board.
So we have two types of sidelined new car buyers then, because the type that I've heard the majority about is sidelined due to inventory capacity, right? That people can't find the car that they want, so they sideline and say they're going to hold out. But what you're saying is that we've got a sideline buyer set that is that, but also a sideline buyer set that is potentially in a higher credit tier, lower income, that, or a lower credit tier, lower income, that can't afford to purchase on the current interest rates and prices. And that's also sideline new car buying, might have pushed to used car buying, but probably also sidelining that buying. So as things regulate, or marketing is attenuated to those places, that we're still going to see inventory sidelining, because we can't even get those customers in those cars because there's not availability. Am I hearing that right?
You got it. So yeah, we have both of these forces going on. There's folks that have left the market, and there's folks that are kind of sitting on the sideline waiting to buy for those products to come in. But all of it suggests that the market going forward is going to be a little bit weaker, that we've lowered our longer term forecast. We think it's going to be a real challenge to get back to a 17 million new vehicle market here in the next couple of years, and that we're probably now on a different trajectory for the new vehicle market.
For the next, you're saying 2 to 3 years,
or maybe even longer. That the prospect of going back to a 17 million plus market, sort of the 2018-19 types of markets that we had, seems less likely the longer this chip shortage goes on, the inventories remain lean. Because on the flip side of all of this, and everybody kind of complaining they can't find their products, the revenues have been relatively strong for the manufacturers. Sales are down, but the per unit profits are the margins are looking very, very strong. They've pulled back dramatically on incentives. We know that they're pulling back on some of their marketing budgets. And all of this means that the margins are quite strong. They don't need to sell 17 million to make the same kind of
profitability. Yeah.
And just to give you a back of the envelope, in 2019, in our own data, transaction price times sales was about a 57 billion market total. In 2022, it was a $60 billion, 2021, it was a $60 billion market, $3 billion higher, and we sold nearly 2 million fewer vehicles.
Wow.
So the higher prices are really mitigating a lot of the smaller volumes. And so there's really not much of a need for the industry to get back to the way it was.
I mean, do you think that this, I'm just kind of guessing here. If there's higher availability of inventory and there's lots of incentives going on, does that incentivize consumers to flip cars more often, cycle through faster? You know, like, hey, there's a good deal. I can get in this new car cheaper. So it's maybe instead of every 4 years, I'm going every 3, or every 3, I'm going like 2.5. Do those two things tie together? Because if so, this limited supply could actually prolong cycle times, over time, and maybe reduce overall profits. Are you following what I'm saying?
I am. One area we definitely see is in the leasing side of the business, right? So in a normal sort of pre-COVID market, about 30% of all retail purchasing or retail activity was a lease. That's fallen dramatically in the post-COVID market. And in fact, I think the most recent data point we had from June was 17%. So from 30 down to 17% is what leasing share is. Those are your folks that every 2 to 3 years are getting a new vehicle. They're churning through these things, but they backed away from the market. There's just not as much of that.
50% cut.
It's a huge cut, and part of it is intentional, that they're not making great lease deals anymore. They'd much rather sell you a vehicle, the manufacturers, than lease you a vehicle.
Well, because you just said they reduced incentives, and so they reduced marketing costs, which makes a whole bunch of sense, right? Because you don't need to market as hard to customers when everything's
supply,
selling.
Right?
But it's really wild that the American consumer, a lot of attention is being placed on dealers raising prices, EV manufacturers raising prices, but technically, what like legacy manufacturers have done over the pandemic is raise prices by not having incentives, which is a really interesting way to perceive that. And so they've raised prices by not having incentives, which thereby increases the bottom line.
This is already baked in, right?
So the profitability is still there, because that's been an argument. So
they've cut back on the discounting, absolutely, and they're focusing on making the most expensive products or the highest margin products.
Right. Back to the target market, right?
The more affluent buyer, which is who's in the market today, and it's been a long-term trend that the affluent buyer is who's buying a new vehicle, but it's really made a stronger shift even in post-COVID market that higher incomes is who's buying the new vehicle these days.
My goodness. Well, look, we're going to have so much, obviously, to talk about at ASOTUCon in just a couple of weeks from now. Charlie, it's going to be great to meet you in person and just watch you mix it up with all the dealers and other industry partners, not just when you're on stage, but also in the room and throughout the event. I hope you can stay and, and trade ideas and bring us along a little more. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today in the Auto Collabs community. On behalf of Kyle and myself and the whole community, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and I look forward to meeting you in a few weeks.
It honestly blows my mind, the fact that leasing post-COVID is down almost 50% of what it was, down from 30% to 17%. The implications of that, a lot of people talk about what the market is
2 or 3 years
doing
from now.
Yeah, what's happening
nuts
right now with inventory, chip shortages, the way the market is, interest rates, everybody's talking about right now. But what that tells me is that in 2, 3, and 4 years, the used car market, the way vehicles are acquired, the lease retention, brand retention is significantly at risk. And there has to be this mentality. Like we typically think about a lot of our data in auto of year over year, month over month. We have to start thinking in these 2 to 3 year timelines on how are we going to retain that customer? How are we getting that customer back when it's not a large portion of leases in new car purchases? It's a problem that I don't think we should be game planning for that 2 and 3 years in the future. And that's hard to do when you're in a month-to-month business. Yeah,
it's not going to happen. I mean, we've just watched a lot of cycles of this happen over the years where you have a glut and then you have a scarcity and then you have a glut. And it really is the natural ebb and flow of this business. And even if you look back, you see that there's always I don't know if you've ever seen
always
Men
a
in
new
Black.
thing.
Right.
Yeah.
There's always a Corellian Death Destroyer waiting to destroy the Earth, right? It's always going to happen. But I'll tell you what, I didn't know Economists were so much fun. I thought Jonathan Smoke was an anomaly. but right. Charlie kind of is oh, that's how y'all rolling. And okay. I think we're cool.
I don't know if I have what it takes to ever consider anything to do with it being an economist, because I feel like I would just be worried all the time for people. I'd be
you walk around oh my gosh,
it's coming.
This happened?
You don't know. You can't see it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I see it's coming.
Right. If you have to have the game
years.
face, there's a meteor coming and I can't let you know about it.
Right. And that you're right, Kyle. To your point, I think it was really interesting how he draws parallels to something like telecom. First, because it's something that we can all relate to, and we are all constant. What just happened as of recent, the iPhone 14 drops. What are all the cell phone companies doing? They were prepped well in advance of hey, here's how you're going to get out of your 13 or your 12. Here's how you can, they had the whole process laid out. And I always find it intriguing, especially when it comes to that in automotive, where we're what in the heck? Where did red tag days come from? And you're oh, you mean the thing that happens at the exact same time every single year for the last 87,000 years? Why is this a surprise?
So true.
It's
so
crazy.
true. Well, look, go ahead, Kyle. You're going to I'm going to
You got Do well.
Well, we hope that we've helped change your perspective of economists to know they're actually the people you want to hang around with at a party, because there's so much dang fun. We had a great time with Charlie. On behalf of Michael Cirillo, Kyle Mountsier, and myself, thanks for listening to Auto Collabs. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to Auto Collabs. Why are we recording?
Are we rolling yet?